Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing some Egg-stra Special Easter cards using the Egg-stra Special collection from Hero Arts. This here is the Daisy cover plate, perfect for creating some fun backgrounds for cards. Then we have the Happy Easter letterpress and foil and cut plate. And then we have the Confetti color layering stencil. This I think would be a great one to do as snow for winter or holiday cards. This is the landscape die set, perfect for creating all of those little borders to the bottoms of your cards. Then we have the Color My World stamp and cut set, lots of adorable Easter images in there, and the Spring Tweetings stamp and cut set. I'm also going to be using the Everyday Sentiment Strips stamps. This one it technically isn't from this collection. It's from the Lilac collection that came out this month as well, but it's perfect to add a little sentiment to my very first card. I'm going to start off by using that Daisy cover plate. I have a piece of A2 cardstock, so 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, covered with some score tape. Then I have a piece of white cardstock that I use to die cut that Daisy image from. And then I have a piece of rainforest cardstock that I will be die cutting that Daisy image to lay over top of these pieces here. So that piece that I already die cut with the Daisy background, I put it over top of my exposed tape, and now I'm going to cover that with some microfine glitter. Now I often will share that I love using microfine glitter with Copic markers to blend on. I have several different videos where I've used it. I did it recently with the Simon Hurley Spellbinders collection. I created an egg-shaped card that uses glitter on the front, and I use Copic markers on top of that glitter. It's a fun technique. It always has a great wow factor to it. For this one, I'm changing that technique up just a tiny little bit. I already have that Daisy image colored. I put the glitter over top of this Daisy cover plate on top of that exposed tape. Then I'm using just a tiny piece of that tape backing in order to burnish that glitter in place. That just makes sure that the glitter has really good contact with the adhesive and it's not going to fall off as much. You're still going to get a little bit of glitter on your Copic markers as you're coloring them, but it's going to reduce that a bit. For that piece of rainforest cardstock, I'm going to cut that Daisy cover plate once more. This is going to overlay my background once I've colored with those Copics, and it's going to make a little bit more sense why I'm doing it this way in just a moment. I taped that die in place because the outline of that die is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. And I wanted to make sure it wasn't going to shift on me while I was doing that die cutting. So I did use some Best Ever Craft tape just to tape that in place. Now this die set, it cuts all the way through. I did make sure that the blade was facing up so that the majority of the pressure was going to go against the blade of this die. So when you get all of these pieces here, the easiest way is to tap it on your desk. Most of them will come out. If there's a few afterwards that don't come out, you can use your tool-in-one or a die pick in order to poke them out. Often it's easiest to do this when it's still in the die, but you could definitely take it out of the die to do that. But I always tap it onto my surface first to get as much of that out as possible. It just takes a little bit less time to only take the ones that are push the ones out that are, giving you a little bit more problem. Now, often I will also do that right over top of my garbage can so that I don't have to clean off my surface. I'm going to take a little bit of peeled paint, distress ink, and do a little bit of ink blending towards the bottom just to create a bit more of an ombre look. I have my piece here on my sticky mat, but you can see it doesn't really want to stick to the sticky mat. It kind of curved when I did my die cutting, so that curve, it doesn't really want to stick to the sticky mat. That's okay. It's enough to cling to it to hold it nicely for me. Then I went and grabbed some Forest Moss distress ink and just did that bottom part of it. I set that over to the side, and I'm only using a couple colors for this. The color that I'm using for the flowers is R22, and this could be done with whatever color you want. It doesn't necessarily have to be done with this color. I use that R22 just in the center of the flower, and then I use my Copic blending pan to blend that out. That way we get a gradation of color, the darkest in the center and lighter towards the outside edges. I do the whole center of the flower before taking my blender pen and blending all of that out. Now, if you've never seen me do this before, a Copic blender pen just rehydrates that ink and then you can spread it out. When I first learned about this technique, I was told that you could do this with dye-based markers as well. And technically you can, it will work. However, That dye ink will never dry on the non-porous surface of the glitter. So you'll always be able to remove color from it. And as you're removing that color, the color lightens. I tested this years ago just to see if it would work, and it did work. But over the weeks of time that I tested it, and I kept pressing my fingers on it, the Copic one dried completely, never removed any color, never lifted any color. The dye-based one, for weeks, I was lifting color of it. And because you're lifting color, you're removing color from that. So after a while, there was really nothing left of the color, very minimal. For the center of the flowers, I'm just using Copic 100. This is just a black. I just wanted a black center and some pinky coral flowers. Now these flowers could be whatever color you want them to be. They don't have to be this color. And then I used that rainforest cardstock. You could do a blue cardstock here too, or any color you want for the background would absolutely work here as well. I used a little bit of my Barely Art glue in my fine line bottle to glue my extra piece down. Now this is why we needed that extra piece here to glue on top of it, because when I colored those Copics, it went right over top of my cardstock there. So it didn't create a really nice, neat finish. By adding that extra layer over top, it covers any of that Copic marker that was on top of the cardstock there. So it just creates a much nicer finish to it. For the sentiment for this card, I'm using that Everyday Sentiment Strips stamp set. Now there is a die set that coordinates with it that makes it much easier to cut these sentiment strips. I don't have it yet. I have it on order. It's on its way, but I don't have it yet. So I will be using my trimmer to trim it down. However, the die set is going to make it so much easier to trim the sentiments much easier. So I have a piece of Hammermill cardstock here. I'm using my Misty stamping tool so that I can stamp this image a couple times. And once it comes to it, you'll see that I should have pressed a little bit harder towards the center of the stamp. If you're using a colored ink stamping with it, obviously that's going to be a little bit more easy to see that. It's a lot harder to see when it's Versamark ink, but this set creates so many different sentiments that I don't really worry about it, because I only plan on using one for this particular video. Any of the extra ones, I'm going to save them for future projects, so they're not going to go to waste. And any of the ones where I don't have a complete sentiment, I'm just going to toss that in the trash. I don't need to have that. And I hadn't really settled on a certain sentiment before doing this. But you can see I create a ton of sentiments all at once by using that embossing powder on there. And I'm using gold for this. It creates that raised edge. It just gives the sentiment just a little bit more substance. That metallic tint also adds a little bit of extra visual texture, as well as adding that raised edge to the sentiment. Then I use my embossing tool to melt that powder in place before I let that cool for a couple seconds, and then I trim it down with my guillotine trimmer. Now the sentiment I'm using with this set is just going to be the main sentiment on top of that daisy background, but you could easily use it as a sentiment in accompanying a die cut sentiment or something like that. I think they make a great pair depending on which one you pick and choose. You can also take some of these sentiments, one will say, "Thank you so much for being my friend," and you can just cut them down to what you want, so you don't necessarily have to use the entire thing. Once I've chosen and trimmed down my sentiment, I want to trim down my background here with that cover plate. Now, this was really not a great idea. My idea to do this was because I wanted to see a little bit of white around the outside edge to see some of that A2 card base. However, we have 3 layers of cardstock here plus the layer of score tape. I started with my guillotine trimmer, and I thought maybe I'd have an easier time with my large tonic trimmer. It cuts that first few inches fairly well, but that last little bit, there's just not enough pressure. There's too much cardstock all at once. So I do have a harder time with it. But of course, because I committed with that first side, I need to keep going. I'm only taking a little sliver off of it. So once I have the line from my blade on that top layer of cardstock, I just use my shears to trim down that extra piece. And again, this is something that I would avoid doing, or I would use, say, a die to trim it down just a little bit, but I didn't think I had a die that was going to trim just that little minimal amount that I wanted off of this. So that is a step that I would advise avoiding and not doing. In hindsight, it's not that important to see a white mask or a white mat around the outside edges. If it covers the entire front, that's totally fine. It was just an idea I had to coordinate with the white on that sentiment as well as the lighter areas for the daisy, but it's not completely necessary. The last step here is using a little bit of glossy accents in that flower center so that it has a little bit of a different texture from the flower petals. So I'm just putting a dot in that hole and then I will let that dry. This is a little bit larger than, say, a dot for an animal eye that I would normally do, so I probably wait about 20-25 minutes for that to completely dry. It starts off looking a little bit milky, and then when it's totally dry, it dries completely clear and glossy. That first little bit there, I got a bit too much on my cardstock, and the easiest way to clean it up is to take a piece of cardstock scrap and use that to clean it up. And there's also a bubble in that one, so I'll use a pin and I will remove that bubble. Best way to do that is with a pin. You definitely want to remove those bubbles before letting them dry. Once they're dry, there's no way to remove that. And here is the first card. Really quite simple, but fun with the different texture of that glitter. And I think that one would also be a fun one to paper piece. However, there is a lot of petals in that background, so I do think paper piecing it would be, while it would be satisfying to put all those pieces in there, I do think it would take a lot longer for that. For the second card and the third card, I'm going to use the Happy Easter letterpress and foil and cut plate. I'm using the solid background with some rainbow foil, and then I'm using the Happy Easter sentiment foil plate, or press and foil plate, with some aura foil. This is gold foil, but it has a holographic shine to it. It's my favorite of the gold foils because of that holographic shine. And because I'm creating Easter cards that have some different colors and some different shimmery bits in there, I think that is going to coordinate beautifully. Once I have my Happy Easter sentiment done, I put my solid egg plate here. And I love this set because you have the solid egg, you have the Happy Easter sentiment foil or press and foil plate. Both of those can be foiled. And then there is an outline egg die to die cut the outside of the egg. So that foiled Happy Easter, I could take that egg die and have that die cut with that. Or I can use the Happy Easter sentiment die to die cut that sentiment out. And I do that for this one. I've created another card with this collection that is already gone live when this one is going live. And I will link it at the end of the video just to give you a few different ideas to use with this collection. That is a tiered hex card. So it's one card. It's got a lot of texture to it, but it's just different ways to use some of these pieces, and I just wanted to share that with you as well. After doing my regular foiling, I use my solid hot foil plate to foil all of the excess pieces. Now, that rainbow foil piece that is left over there, I will likely just save that for a future project to use with die cutting. The negative piece here with the egg, I'm going to use it with the egg die to create a negative foiled egg. So my egg is going to have that aura foil to it, and then I'm going to have a white sentiment to it. All of that bit of aura foiled cardstock around the outside edge, I'll keep that for smaller die cuts for flower centers, so it is not going to go to waste. I often will use my solid hot foiled pieces as a replacement for specialty cardstock because it has such a unique look to it, and it's better to do that than to waste it. Why not use it to create some unique pieces? Once I have my Happy Easter solid foiled piece done, I'm going to use that same egg die to cut my rainbow foiled one. There's also confetti foil that I think would be really, really fun with this solid egg as well. I chose the rainbow foiled one just because I thought it was a little bit less chaotic for the card that I wanted to create, but I do think that confetti one would be a really fun one with this as well. Then I'm using the Happy Easter sentiment die with this set, matching it up, using some Best Ever craft tape to tape that in place so that when I go to die cut, that die is not going to move on me. I am going to take this and I'm going to layer it on top of my rainbow foiled egg. So we have two different foiled pieces. We have that solid foiled egg in the background, and then the foiled sentiment in the front. It does, when you die cut that Happy Easter, it creates a bit of a halo around it with that white cardstock. So that's just going to help that pop off of that busier background just a little bit better. Now I left it white here, but you could, if you wanted, you could do a little bit of ink blending to color that. For that other card that I was talking about, I do that. I use the this die to cut out the sentiment, but I used the sentiment in the Letterpress system instead, and then I did ink that so that it would go a bit better or pop off a little better on the egg that I created for that card. But I love that it does have that white halo around it, so when I go to glue this down to the rainbow bit or the rainbow egg, it does pop off and it shows off that sentiment just a little bit more. Now, because this rainbow egg and my Happy Easter sentiment are both foiled, they have a lot going on there. So I wanted to create a background that had some texture to it, but was a little bit more subtle. I wanted it to kind of frame and show off that egg, but I still wanted it to have its own texture to it. So I took this Birdsong script cling stamp. This is from the Lilac collection that came out this month, and I already have a video out using that collection. I'm just stamping this on the back of, or the on some Hammermill cardstock for a background. I started with that Broken China Distress ink, then I added a little bit of Uncharted Mariner Distress ink so that it would have a two-tone to it. You can see though that by stamping it, I have some lines on it. So I am going to hide them a little bit with some ink blending. And by lines, I mean from the edges of the stamp pad. So I am going to create a mat from one piece of Hammermill cardstock, and that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. This piece here was trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm using some peeled paint and then some Forest Moss Distress ink on the bottom edge of this cardstock just to create kind of a grassy area for my egg to sit. Then I'm going to ink blend the background with that tumbled glass as well as that Uncharted Mariner. And that's just going to tone down the lines that I got from my ink pad. And you can see that just doing that tumbled glass already toned it down more than it was, made it a little bit more subtle, but you can still see them there. Then I go in with that Uncharted Mariner, and I always like to do a darker blue around the outside edges just to kind of frame everything in. I pretty much avoided the center because the egg is going to cover that anyway, so I didn't need to have that completely covered. And you can see my ink blending of those blues is not totally even. I do that on purpose. I think it's a little bit more visually interesting to have some areas that are lighter and some areas that are darker. Now, even though I decided I was going to create a mat for this, I already changed my mind. I took some gold matte cardstock from the Treasured Gold cardstock pack. I'm going to create a mat with this. That's going to coordinate nicely with the Aura foiled sentiment, and it's going to frame it nicely. So I trimmed that to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Now, typically when I'm using this cardstock, I'll die cut stuff out of the center so that it has a dual purpose to it. I didn't have anything that I needed die cut at that moment, so I don't do this with this. Another option would be to use a gold ink pad around the outside edges so that you still get that gold matte, but you're not using some more expensive specialty cardstock. So that's another option there as well. Then I glued down my ink blended background here, and then I'm going to add that egg to the front. So this is a very, very simple laid out card, but because we have that foiled egg with the rainbow foil plus the Aura foiled Happy Easter and our ink blended background, we have a lot of visual dimension with it because of those different textures. For my next card, I'm going to use the solid hot foiled Happy Easter egg background. Now, I wanted to create a look of a step card, but I wanted it to be on an A2 card base. So I have a piece of cardstock here that is cut to 3 3/4 inches by 8 1/2 inches. Then I am scoring it at the 5 1/2 inch mark, the 6 1/2 inch mark, the 7 1/2 inch mark, and then the 8 inch mark. Now, I will put these measurements on or in the description below so that you can see it written somewhere. Now, what this is going to do, this is going to go on the front of that card, and it's going to give those steps in that front of the card, but it's going to go on a regular A2 card base. I also have a mat there that I trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/2 inches. Then I die cut 2 grass borders using that landscape die set. This is a piece of rainforest cardstock that is 3 3/4 inches by 1 1/2 inches, and then the peridot cardstock that I'm going to be using next started out at 3 3/4 inches by 1 inch. And I just put that border die close to the top, taped it in place so that it wasn't going to move on me while I was die cutting. And then we have 2 grass borders, one a little bit thicker than the other, ready to put on those steps that we created for the front of the card. Now, I know I want to do a little bit of ink blending to my card background, and I also want a little bit of ink blending on these grass borders. I have the bottom edges close together or facing together so that I could just do my ink blending in one step for both pieces. You're going to see the peridot one more on the front of the card than you are on the background of the card. This here is that mat that I cut, and it is just going to be showing on the two sides of my image piece. So I'm only doing the ink blending on the sides. Another option here would be to use some colored cardstock, but because I just want that green there, that green is already in for my ink blending for my grass pieces. This is going to coordinate nicely. For my background, I'm going to use that tumbled glass again, as well as that Uncharted Mariner. And just like before, I'm going to make sure that it's not completely even. So I'm going to do some areas that are lighter than others, some areas that are darker. Again, I just find it visually more interesting. If you prefer it to be completely evenly ink blended, absolutely do that. I always love how everyone has different preferences and styles, and it just makes things a lot more interesting. So after doing the tumbled glass, I went and did the Uncharted Mariner, and I had put a piece of scrap paper on the bottom steps of that piece there because it didn't need to be ink blended. The front pieces of those are going to be covered with our grass die cut pieces. The back pieces of them are not really going to be visual or shown, but I also didn't want to have it look messy and have that ink on there. So I first glued my first mat to the base of the card, and you can see that the mat or the sides of the card are the only pieces that are visual or the showing. Then I glued my little step piece there, and I glued it in the center so you can see those grass pieces or the green pieces. Then I glued my green grass border die cuts. Now, when I glued that first one, you could see a little bit of the white pieces of the step of it. So I just raised that a little bit. It doesn't really matter if it goes all the way to the bottom. We're just creating a grass border for our egg and for our little characters to sit in. So I'm going to first glue my egg down so that that can be drying while I'm creating the little characters. And I'm using some of the rabbits from the Color My World Stamp and Cut set. I'm only gluing that egg to the back layer of the grass, and so I only need to put that glue on the bottom. I want that egg to be popped out of the card base, and I also want our little rabbits to be that too. Now, I know that I'm going to be using this set for my next card as well, so I'm going to be stamping and embossing more pieces that I need for the card that I'm creating. I'm going to do them for the next card as well. I might as well do this all at the same time rather than doing it in 2 steps. I have a piece of distressed watercolor cardstock here, and I'm putting all of the stamps that I intend to use on this piece for this card as well as for my next card. Now I want to do some watercoloring with some distressed watercolor pencils. I want my outlines to be visible, but I don't want them to overtake my images. So rather than doing, say, black outlines, I am going to heat emboss them with some pumice stone distress glaze. Pumice stone is kind of a brown gray, so it's going to work nicely with the images that I'm using. And it's going to have those lines show, but they're just going to be a little bit more subtle than if I were to outline it or emboss it with black. That would be a little bit more stark because we're creating a spring card and something that's just kind of fun and bright and light. I didn't really want black for this. So I put a little bit of embossing powder tool on my watercolor cardstock here. And when I'm using watercolor cardstock to stamp and heat emboss, watercolor cardstock has one side that is more textured than others, so I will look at both of the sides and I will use the side that is less textured. It just creates a nicer look for the stamped and embossed images. So I stamped that a couple times, making sure to get crisp, clean images throughout the whole thing. And then I put that piece onto my scrap piece of paper here. This is just going to collect all the excess of that distress glaze. That can go right back into the jar, so there's no waste to it. If by chance, like on that egg there, you get a little bit of extra powder sticking to something that was there, you can either brush it off with your finger or use a tiny brush to clean that up. And we definitely want to be doing that before we heat emboss our images. But you can see that because I'm not using black outlines, it's just more subtle. It's just you're going to see the image more than you're going to see the outline of them. So then I use my embossing tool to melt that embossing powder on there. And while I'm doing that, I'm regularly tilting it to the light so I can make sure that everything is melted properly. Now, the great thing about embossing glaze is it comes in a bunch of different colors. So if by chance this pumice stone is too light of a look for you, you could always choose a darker brown or a darker gray in order to do this. You would still have a little bit more of a subtle look than if it was black, but you have some more options there. And then that outline of the egg, The Distress Glaze comes in so many different colors. You could easily do that in a color if you chose to do so. So for the pencil set that I'm using for these cards, I'm using Distress Watercolor Pencil Set 5. All of the colors that I'm going to be using are from this set. So I start with the pink, and I think that was Worn lipstick, and I'm going to do the egg. I want the heavier of the color to be around the outside of the egg. I'm also going to be using that confetti stencil on top of this egg. So I want the color there. I don't want a lot of color. I want it just to kind of be brushed, like kissed with color, so that we have an egg that's not completely white. But I want to make sure that when I do my stenciling on there, I can still see all that. I also use that color to add a little bit of color to the tip of the brushes, as well as the inside of the bunny ears. Now, when I chose the Distress Color Pencil set, or watercolor pencil set, I chose ones that had the different tones that I wanted for the cards that I was creating. They have 6 different sets there, so you can easily swap out other sets instead of this exact set. It doesn't necessarily need to be this exact set. The bunnies here, I am watercoloring them with the Pumice Stone watercolor pencil. This is one of the reasons why I chose this set. I wanted those bunnies to be a light color. I didn't want them to be completely white, but I also didn't want them to be totally brown. The other card that I had created with this collection, I colored the images with Copic marker, so you can see in that video these images colored in a different way, and I did my bunnies brown for that. So I wanted these ones to be a little bit different than how I colored those. I also didn't want them to be completely white. I wanted them to have a little bit of color to them. So I opted for the Pumice Stone for that reason. They have some color. They're not totally dark brown, but they're also not white. So when I'm doing my watercoloring here, I always start where I want my color to be darkest, and then I brush that color out. And as you're using the brush, you'll have less and less color on your water brush. I have a water brush here that has water right in the handle, and to my right I have a piece of paper towel. So if by chance I have too much water on my brush, I can tap it on that paper towel. Or if I have too much color on my brush, I can tap it on that paper towel. Because I'm watercoloring here, if I get through that whole bunny and I think I have or want more color to it, I can always add more color. If I get through that whole bunny and I think, you know what, that's just too dark, it's darker than I want it to be, I can take the color off of my brush and I can lift that color. When you're watercoloring, that color sits on top there for a few minutes, so you have time to lift that color off. It's a little bit more forgiving than if you were to, say, color with markers. You'd have to add more color. It's not as easy to take it away when you're using markers. So once I have my pieces watercolored, I let that dry for a few minutes, and then I'm using the dies to die cut all of those pieces. Now you can die cut the entire sheet out as long as your die cuts or your dies don't overlap. You don't want to have any die overlapping, because if it overlaps when it's going through the machine, that's going to ruin your die. If by chance you have some images that are a bit too close that those dies would overlap, do a second pass with the machine with that other image. Make sure that you don't go through your machine with your dies overlapping. So better to do more than one step with your die cutting than possibly ruin your tools. Now, as I was putting those dies on, I realized that I hadn't watercolored, I think it was the bucket, and then I think there was something else, I can't remember what it was. So I just added that color to it. Didn't really wait for it to dry to do my die cutting, because I wanted to make sure that, because that color doesn't stay wet for very long. It was a small area, so I didn't really have to wait too long for that to dry anyways. Once I have all of my dies taped in place, I can put it through my die cutting machine. Now you can look at here and see how much of that Best Ever Craft tape I've used to tape those dies in place. I reuse that tape over and over again. I probably get 5, 6, 7 uses out of it. So you can extend the use of your Best Ever Craft tape. It's almost like Post-it note tape. It sticks a little bit better than Post-it notes, but it's a great way to tape those pieces in place. And then I just have a drawer that I stick those extra pieces on, and I just keep using them until they don't really stick too well or don't really hold anything too well. So you can get many uses out of it, and that extends the use of your best ever craft tape. Now that I have those pieces done, die cut, ready to go, I chose 3 bunnies to go on this card here. The rest of them are going to go on my next card. I wanted to have a bunny on either side of that egg on the background or the back layer of grass, and then I wanted one for the forefront. So here is that finished card there. You can see that the card stands up nicely. We have the little step feature on the front of it, but it adds that extra little bit of dimension. It folds nice and flat for an envelope, so you don't have to worry about needing a puffier envelope or a wider envelope because of that dimension to it. Just a little bit of a different look for a card front. So for this egg here, I want to use that confetti stencil. So I have my sticky mat out. This stencil set has 4 different layers to it, and I'm going to do that stenciling with some interference inks. It's going to add that extra little bit of fun shimmer that those interference inks have. If you've never heard of interference inks before, they are, in my opinion, magic pads. They have one look on white or light cardstock and a completely different look on black or dark cardstock. Here, I am only using them for that shimmer property. You can see the front of each one of those pads has 2 colors on it. The color on the left is the color you're going to see on the white or light cardstock. The color on the right is the color you're going to see on black or dark cardstock. But when you do use them on light cardstock, you still, when you tilt them into the light, get that shimmer that shows up on the black or dark cardstock. So it just has a different finish from other inks. And I thought it would be really fun to use them as speckles on this particular egg. So I used Sunset Pink, which is an exclusive one to scrapbook.com. Then I used Crushed Velvet and Teal Twist interference inks for those 3 layers. The last layer here, I'm using some Moondust Stickles glitter gel. I thought it would be fun to have some glitter spots on here. Now when I'm putting that on, I'm using it with a palette knife to help spread it, and I'm trying to make sure I don't get any on my sticky mat. It doesn't come off this sticky mat super easy, so I'm trying to avoid that. I let that dry completely, and here is that finished egg. So we have that really beautiful shimmer from those interference inks, and then we also have the sparkle and the texture from the Stickles glitter gel. And that shimmer and glitter is a really nice contrast to the Distress watercolor pencil, because the Distress watercolor pencil finish is a little bit more of a matte, chalkier finish. So I really like the contrast between the two. For this card here, I am die cutting or trimming down a piece of Hammermill cardstock to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches for my mat. And I'm using my Sunset Pink interference pad to just rub around the edges there. This is going to add that color that coordinates with the speckles on the egg, and it's also going to have that beautiful shimmer that those interference inks have. And if you've never seen interference inks before, I have a whole playlist with videos where I use them in many different ways. I use them often. I absolutely love them. They're so fun to create with. For the background of my card, I trimmed another piece of Hammermill cardstock to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm going to create a very, very simple background here for this. So I'm just doing some simple ink blending, starting off with that peeled paint and then the forest moss, then going in and doing the tumbled glass and Uncharted Mariner for the sky. For these cards, I'm creating super simple backgrounds I want the hint of color there. I want the suggestion that we have grass and sky here, but I want the focus to be on the little bunnies, the little egg. I want the focus to be on the little characters that we have on the card. So I'm not spending a whole lot of time to do that ink blending around the background. I don't necessarily need it to be a realistic scene. I just need it to have that pretty color and the suggestion of having some sky and grass here. So once I have this done, I'm ready to start assembling my card. So I have an A2 card base here. I'm going to glue down my mat. And when I put that interference ink on my mat, I only did it around the edges. The center part is going to be completely covered with my other background here. So it's not yet necessary to use more ink than I need to ink blend around that mat. You're not going to see that center of that anyways. I glue that down, and while I have my acrylic block there, it just holds everything down nice and flat, frees up my hands for positioning things. I can put my pieces on my block to see how they're going to look on my background. Now I chose to do my egg in a pink color because I wanted to make sure it was going to show up off of my background colors. After I have my egg down there, I can glue down my little bunnies and their paint brushes as well as their paint bucket. I use the Barely Art Glue in the fine tip bottle for pretty much everything. It works really well as a glue. It starts to grab and hold in like, I don't know, 5-10 seconds, but it gives you that wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. And it also makes it nice and easy to put or to assemble small die cuts by using that fine line bottle. And you can also easily use it to assemble cards. Now I wanted my sentiment to pop off a little bit more, so I ink blended it with that Sunset Pink Interference ink. I'm going to put that on the sky of this particular card. Now, the sentiment is from that Color My World set. Each one of the Stampin' Cut sets has a few different sentiments to choose from. So I love the fact that there are sentiments in each one of those sets that coordinate perfectly with them. Now, it was at this point that I decided that the pink that I had on the brushes wasn't quite bright enough. So I went and I smushed my Sunset Pink Interference pad on my work surface and used that as a watercolor paint. The interference inks are water reactive, so you can use them to watercolor, and I do it quite often. You don't get as much shimmer when you watercolor with them because you're diluting them with water, but it adds a really fun look to it. And where that color is darkest, you get a little bit of the hint of shimmer. So it's just got a really unique look to it. For my last card, I'm going to be using the Spring Tweetings Stampin' Cut set. So just like the Color My World one, I have some watercolor cardstock here that I'm putting my stamps on, and I just use as many stamps to fill in that piece of cardstock as possible. However, when I'm putting them down on that cardstock, I am mindful that I want to die cut them and I want to leave space around there to die cut. You could easily put these stamps closer than I have right here, but then you're likely going to need to do your die cutting in 2, 3, or however many different steps so that you don't have those die cuts overlapping each other. So I am mindful when I'm doing this to try to keep as much space as I need for those dies so that I could do it in one step, but not too much, because I want to get more images here than, I always like to have more images than I think I need. So then, when I'm creating, if by chance I end up deciding I want to use more, I'm not stopping and creating some more images. So I'm going to stamp and emboss these with that same pumice stone glaze. I really liked the look of that for the last card, and I didn't really want to introduce another glaze color. You certainly could here if you wanted. You can see that when I pour my glaze on here, I'm pretty generous with it. I do it over the entire piece of that cardstock. That's because we're doing it on scrap paper. Anything that goes back on that paper that doesn't stick to the ink goes right back in the jar. There's no waste to it. And just like before, if there's a place where that glaze is sticking that you don't want it to stick, you just need a soft brush to brush that off to clean that up before doing that heat embossing. Once our embossing is done, I am going to be using that same watercolor distress pencil set, number set 5, to do my watercoloring for each one of these images. But I'm also going to incorporate some of those interference inks for those eggs. I thought it would be fun to have that matte finish of those watercolor pencils for the basket, for that little chocolate bunny, but then to add the bright color as well as the interference, like the shimmery properties to those eggs. I thought it'd be a nice contrast. So once again, grabbing the different pencils, and most of the pencils that I'm using are the same ones that I used for the last card. So here we have some gathered twigs. I'm going to use that for the basket. I'm also going to use that for the chocolate bunny. And once again, I start where I want the color to be darkest. When I have an area wet from the water in my brush, I can always add some more color just to give it a little bit more visual dimension, a little bit more shading. But I typically will start where I want the color to be darkest and then brush my way out to where I want it to be the lightest and fill in that whole area so it is damp before adding more ink or taking some away. So when it's wet, that color is naturally going to start to blend and bleed with each other. And by doing that, I can also avoid having lines from having, like I say, a dry edge somewhere. So I'll typically work within sections when I'm doing that watercolor. So you can see here, I started with the inside of that basket, then I did the outside of the basket, then I did the handle, then I did the outside of the basket. So I'm working within different sections. I'm not doing that entire basket as one. By heat embossing these images, I also made it a little bit easier for myself with that watercoloring because that heat embossing leaves that raised ridge. It makes it so that ink wants to stay within that area. There's a little bit more of a barrier to it. I went and I watercolored the chocolate bunny with that same color. And once I had it watercolored, I realized that I lost a lot of the detail from that pumice glaze embossing. So you can see how I had it darker, but I went and I lifted up some of that ink to make it lighter in order to be able to see those that ink. So that's what I was talking about earlier, where if you get a little bit too much color, you can lift that color up because it's just sitting on the surface for the first little while until it starts to sink in. Then I chose the yellow from the set, and I can't remember what the color is. I just showed it frozen on the screen for a second, but I used that for the little chicks. Then I used some Ripe Persimmon for the little dot for their beaks. Now, again, with those chicks, I did the same thing. I started where I want it to be a little bit darker and then worked my way a little bit lighter. If you wanted to use more than one watercolor pencil set, you could choose a darker color and add some visual dimension that way. I wanted to stick within one set. I typically will try to stay within one set if possible, unless I have specific colors that I definitely want to use for whatever reason. I stay within one set. First of all, it gives you a little bit of a challenge to use colors that you don't necessarily always use together, and I embrace that challenge at times. And then the other thing, again, it just limits your supplies just a little bit. I used the Sunset Pink Interference ink. I smushed it on my surface here to use as paint for the bow for the basket as well as for the egg. With the egg, I want it to be darker all the way around, but I do want one area, and typically that for me, that's the bottom of the egg where it's a little bit darker. So I went around that whole thing, made that darker around the outside edge, and then filled in the entire egg and then added a little bit more ink towards the bottom. I also used that same color on those little eggshell pieces. One of them I don't use in the card, and the reason is when I took the piece off of my die cutting machine, it fell right into the garbage can and I couldn't find my piece. There was too many little paper scraps in there to find it, so I ended up not using it at all. That's totally fine. I went and grabbed the Teal Twist Interference ink and I used that for my next egg here. This one is a whole egg, but it's got some cracks in it. And I also used it for the stripes on one of the stripy eggs. So when I did that, I put the ink where I wanted it to be darkest on each one of those stripes, cleaned the excess ink off of my brush, and then blended those two areas together. Now, like I said before, with these interference ink, when you use them to watercolor, you're not going to get nearly as much shimmer as you do when you either stamp with them or ink blend with them, because that water is dehydrating or extending that ink a little bit. But where that ink is the darkest, where the color is the darkest, you are going to get deposits of that interference. So there is going to be some shimmer to it. It's just going to be a little bit more subtle than it is if you stamp with it or if you ink blend with that ink. So it coordinates with the interference when you use it around the mat, but it's just a little bit more of a subtle shimmer. If you wanted something that was in your face shimmery, you could use some Perfect Pearls, hydrate them with some water and use them as paint, and I've done that before. But I just love the vibrant color that you get with these interference inks with that little bit of subtle shimmer. I think it's a really pretty look, especially for those eggs. So once I have all of those pieces watercolored and I let that dry, I went and die cut them all. Same as I did for the last card. You can see when you die cut them, you get a little bit of a white halo around the outside edge. I love that because I think it just makes those pieces stand up a little bit more on your background. If you don't want that, when you're doing your watercoloring, you can go a little bit outside the edge, or you can choose whatever color you're using to ink blend your background and put that around the outside edge so that creates a little bit more of a subtle look to it. I'm going to use that crushed velvet interference ink for the mat for this one. So this is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. The inside part is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So I'm doing that very same ink blending on my background as I did for my last card. However, once I'm done my ink blending, I'm going to add just a little bit or a little extra step just to give it a little bit of a different texture. So I start with that the peeled paint and then the forest moss. Then I go in with that broken china and then uncharted mariner. I've said these names too many times. My brain's going fuzzy. I'm using large Spellbinders brushes for these backgrounds because you can get just a little bit of ink or you can get a larger amount of ink. The Distress ink is water reactive as well. So I took a little bit of water and put it in my hand there and then splattered it on the background, then grabbed a piece of paper towel and lifted that ink up. It just gives it a little bit of extra texture there. Now, if you leave that water there a little bit longer before using that paper towel on there, it would remove a little bit more color. So you can pick and choose how much you want to see there. I just wanted there to be a little bit more texture to that background, just something to add a little bit of visual interest. Then I'm ready to assemble my card there. I put that mat onto that background there, and I chose the color for the mat because it coordinates with the eggs, but it also is a contrasting color from my background. For both this card as well as the one before, I didn't use that teal twist because I thought that teal twist was going to be a little bit too close of a color or to that Broken China Uncharted Mariner background there. I didn't think it was going to add enough contrast to frame it. So that's why I chose those particular colors for this card, because I wanted it to be contrasting. I wanted it to coordinate with those eggs and the little details, but I wanted it to frame it. I'm adding the pieces to the inside of that basket before adding them to the card. And when you die cut there, it die cuts a little slit right into that basket there to help insert those things in the basket, which is very, very handy. And that way it looks like those little bits are inside that basket there. Then I'm going to add the bow to the top of the basket. I have two different sentiments that I stamped and die cut, and I did that off screen. It didn't fit into my background. So these are not done on watercolor cardstock, but that's not necessary because I kept them on just white cardstock and they're not being watercolored. So it doesn't need to be watercolor cardstock for that. The process was exactly the same as embossing those images on that watercolor cardstock though. Once I have my basket on there as well as my sentiments, I'm ready to add my little chicks. I saved one of those eggs to go in front of the basket. I have one of my little eggshell pieces to go. I'm going to put it a little behind that basket because I don't have both of them. I'll stick one of those chicks in front of it, and then the third one on the side. And now typically we'll have odd numbers when it comes to little things like that. Like that first card that I did with the bunnies, I had 3 bunnies. Here I have 3 chicks. There's 4 different ones to choose from in the set, but things tend to look better in odd numbers. They're a little bit more visually appealing, so I chose to only use 3 for this card. I'm adding a little bit of stickles to some of the details on the egg as well as some of the details on that bow. It's just going to add a little bit of extra textures. I typically will use Stardust stickles. It has an opalescent look to it, so you can still see the color underneath there. It just adds the glitter, the sparkle, and it will coordinate with anything you're doing because we're not adding any more color. So there is the finished card with some beautiful interference shimmer as well as that stickles glitter shimmer to it. And then we have our second card with that little speckled egg. I absolutely love these chicks and bunnies and think they're so adorable. There's so many different options in each one of those Stamp and Cut sets. So there's so many different ways that you could go with this, but it pairs really nicely with that press or letterpress and foil and die set as well. This here is the card with that step front. So it's just an A2 card base, but it looks a little bit more like a step card. It's kind of a hybrid between the two. You can see that when you lift my card up, that egg flips forward. That's because it's just so heavy. You could also put a little bit of an anchor to it if you didn't want it to do that. But I think when it's sitting on your mantle or whatnot, it doesn't really matter. Then we have our rainbow foil card with that Happy Easter. Super, super simple, but the focus is that rainbow egg and the Happy Easter. And then our daisy plate background here. And I'll give you a little sneak of that hex tiered card using this collection that I already did as a video, and again I'll link that at the end here. So this one here, it has so much texture to it, but it lies flat for mailing. It stands up nicely and gives you a lot of dimension to it. But another video that has some more ways to use this collection. I wanted to give you many different ideas because there are so many different things in this collection. I thought it's always nice to have more ideas for it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.